Well, hello.
Hello,
Good afternoon.
and to you as well.
So today we have 11 Thursdays, and I'm not counting the Thursday right before FanFest because that's too close because we're
Because
gonna
you're
be like
smart.
in Vegas. So if we were to sit down and think of topics and think of the way you would compare games and compare lore in games, like the topics that jump out to me, first of all, are things like where does our world come from?
hmm
Who are the gods and like metaphysical systems like magic and like what happens when we die, like as far as like the basics of how we operate within those worlds.
Do we care to talk about anything to do with things that are about creation of the game? Like, do we want to talk about things that are like the level to which retcons have been, the two different ways retcons and recontextualizations have been handled, or things like that? Or do we want to stick true, like purely within the text? What has that said? You know?
I mean, lore wise, like it is interesting to always think about what the writer was going through when analyzing a book or what was going on in the world at the time. That's something very common in art history, is when you look at these
Yep.
movements, it's like, oh, and then one day everybody just decided to start painting differently, and it's like, well, that's never really the case. A lot of
Yep.
times it's a question of like, well, who were the patrons at the time, and so if the money started coming from a different place.
Well, and even when you can even branch that out too, when it's the non-personal stuff, but it's like you don't end up with Art Deco without industrialization. hmm
Personally, when comparing the games, I think it starts to get a little too hard to just point at like what was going on with the devs. Especially when you start to see multiple parallels where like every game felt like it had an expansion with Shadow in the title. I find comparing physics systems a lot more interesting.
Yeah.
So what are the equivalents to the elements? And that comes down to world building. What makes a world fun to be a part of is that it's real.
No, I think that's the problem is investment, right? Like the problem, there's two things actually. One of which is like the problem is if you invest in something as being true and it's your understanding of the world and the narrative's taking no efforts to say this is ambiguous or or there are unreliable narrators. You can't take everything at face value. If it treats things as word of law,
Right.
and then goes back on that, the problem is that it breaks the trust. Do you think that games in some way are actually really struggle because their limits can be so easily defined? So like not easily defined, but like Limsa within canon and within the world is supposed to have thousands of people living in it, right? But the limitation of the game means that it's only impressionistic. Whereas if it was a book, if you write about Limsa, you can say there's hundreds of thousands of people, and it's words. It takes you like 5 seconds to write them.
So I would say that like mediums just have strength, and like World of Warcraft throws that strength totally to the wind. They just introduce new continents in the dead center of the sea, and they're like, oh yeah, but before you couldn't see it because magic.
Well, and I would say that's, to me, my face. I like things that are evocative, and then the benefit is something like what 14 does, right? Like it threw out Maricidia, it threw out, all of that stuff. It throws out that stuff and has that there to be built upon. I think what's interesting to me there is what's the question of at what point is your evocation actually detracting?
Like in 14, what if we never go to Mercidia? What if we never go to Corvos? And like, what if what we've seen so far out of Garlemald is all we ever see? Like, you've spun up something that dwarfs basically everything from like Mongolia to Siberia, and we're gonna see half of one city at one point in time. There's like one torn down swing set, and that's just not like Limsa being. It should be thousands, but instead it's an upper and lower deck for players. That's still, it feels large, it feels like a place. Garlemald doesn't. Garlemald does not feel like a place. Like it feels like a dungeon or a raid. It never took on that same thing.
So interesting. So can I pick your mind on that though then? Because like to me, like pound for pound, when I go to Garlemald, especially because, and I know this is literally only what we're seeing, but we're seeing the southern half of the city because there's obviously the northern half. But we don't literally see it, so that's not really a defense of it. But like to me, it feels like more like a city than Limsa does almost, because Limsa is just like a castle or two. And so it's interesting to hear you say that, because it's like, then to you, is it the people that makes it feel alive? Is it that that you can't go to all the buildings, but there are some more? I'd be curious, like.
I think it has to do with how do you set it up. So, like, Garlemald is referenced constantly and heavily, and we learn a lot about Garleans and the place that they've called home. And so it's your friend had told you about them over and over, and you'd like read their like LinkedIn profile, and you'd followed them on social media, and then you meet them for the first time and they only say like one sentence, and then they just sit there quietly, and then they get up and leave. There's something really underwhelming. Like, they didn't live up to what they were built up to be in your head. And then, like, one of the things about places like Bosja and Zadnor and stuff like that is I like when places feel dangerous.
Was Garlemald underwhelming to you because we came to it only once and it was in ruins, or because of its scale? Because the reason, part of what I'm curious is that Garlemald always was described as being a city-state. So, like, it always was a singular city.
When I look at Garlemald, like, it's a city-state, but, like, it's Moscow over all of Russia. Russia spans, like, 11 time zones or something stupid. Like, you know, so now you go to Moscow and you don't get to go inside any of their big buildings. You don't get to go inside any of their government buildings or their religious buildings. And the zone's so trashed, we don't really get to, like, eat in any local restaurants and stay with a local innkeep.
Would filling out Ilsabard more generally, do you think, help with any of that feeling? Or do you feel... Because part of the struggle, right, is that with Garlemald, we as the Warrior of Light were never going to come in and get to, like, you know, and it be, like, fine. You know, like, even if it had been a high, like, we're going to come in and it's, like, every gun's trained on us, right? I definitely empathize with wanting to know more, but it's... I guess the reason I didn't feel like I missed out on Garlemald at its height is I don't know that we ever should have been there.
You know, the advantage of the way the Warrior of Light is written is that we have this soul that's kind of borrowed, and we are experiencing one chapter of it, but that soul has been carried through time and has always kind of been the Asm. So that kind of implies that we could go back to previous chapters of the Asm. We could go play, that we could do a lot and visit it. So if the whole argument is that, like, the person in the year of Stormblood cannot be in Garlemald, then just don't go there during Stormblood. 14 also uses instance content to regularly document places. So, like, if there's a city that we don't have a reason to go to, they can make a dungeon out of it.
Right.
The area that we go to for the Relit quests that kind of feed into those trials, it's a place. Like, you can put it on a global map, and it's documented, and it's real.
You know, and so my hope is, like, I think you could do, you know, we did Lapis Liminalis, for this past content, you know, which is Garlean stuff.
Yes.
My hope is that we could someday see a Criterion dungeon for, like, the northern section of, like that they'll continue to use that format as a way to of Garlemald.
Yeah, so we had the Autumn War mentioned in Stormblood, and it's most heavily documented, like, event by event, timeline by timeline, in a way you can visualize it. In the Monk quest, verbally. There's no visual representation of what he's telling you.
I mean, that's Eric in general, too. Like, all his stuff where he's just like, hey, did you actually want to have an NPC just tell you some shit? Even if you don't know Alamigo, if you are even passingly aware of Alamigo and feel like that's real, it's their conflict with Gridania, right? So it's like, even what I've seen is even people who don't have that relationship with Alamigo yet, because if they have a relationship with Gridania, they can at least understand that. Like, it roots them in something.
And that's where I really struggle with Ilsabard. Ilsabard in general is just more gaps than not. And that's something
the danger of MMOs, though, right? Like, it kind of goes back to what we're talking about, right? If you want to keep creating places you can go to, sometimes ill-defining them can also be a way to, like, make it be like, okay, but we don't know what Ilsabard looks like because of just, like, someone put up a telescope, like, someone do a cartography, please.
You know, we can have an expansion that adds a bunch of before times, and we can have an expansion that adds a bunch of, you know, from a dystopian future, and then maybe a different dystopian future, and then the way before times, and, like, we can just keep going around and around and around. Because I do have questions about, like Allig and the Autumn War. Like, it'd be great to go back and experience that.
So I have a video that I've been working on for, like, a month now that is, like, just really going deeply into time travel in 14. What's interesting is that so far everything exists within a form of a fixed loop. So there's a lot of ways you can still do that even if they don't go the time travel route.
As we get beyond, like, the surface of the world and you look at, like, time and stuff, you also start to ask, how do games like this solve deities?
Well, that's why I like 14, because like 14's ultimate message, at least so far, has been it find your own way, and also God is dead. We have killed him, or we have killed her. Why does Aether and Dynamis exist? It's not because there was some creator. As far as the game has claimed so far, it's just the Big Bang. Like, as far as we know, the Big Bang happened, and things are just here.
Yeah, because we start with the myths of the 12, right? But the 12 are believed in by Eorzea. So they're a lot closer to like the Greek gods, which were documented as a religion at the same time that there were other documented religions elsewhere in the world. And so now you're taking the faith component totally out, because we can see the 12.
Right. Well, and one of the things that 14 get at is it's not just, oh, what if all the gods were real? It's what if the fact that we believed in all the gods made them real? Primals. A primal is just faith and energy given form. It's just, I believe in this story. Here's a bunch of crystals. This story is now real. This story is now a creature made manifest. And so it's like, when you play ARR, the primals are a very big part. They're important. You don't have you understand on a pragmatic level, I need to fight them. I'm not tempered by them. They have these, but they're not like fully, completely explained, which means that there's more to discover about them, which means that as they're broadened, it doesn't feel like you had this predefined thing that had existed for 10 years with very specific limits, and then all of a sudden we're adding stuff.
Yeah, it planted a lot of seeds when you talk about like creation magic, and sure. You see it in like the humans are told, when we're told by science that we only use like a fraction of our brain power or whatever, then all of a sudden you can go write a book series on like, what if we could activate our whole brain power? Humans sleep a third of the time because we need this. Well, what if we didn't? Like, what would happen if a human never had to sleep?
Weaknesses are more interesting than powers. And humanity can be a weakness. Like, not that humanity is a bad thing, but like, humanity being your vulnerability, right? Caring and having compassion and empathy and navigating that in the world can be a weakness in a sense. But that's far more interesting than, I care about nothing, I have unlimited power and nothing can stop me. It's there's nothing, what do you want to write about? Like, there's no conflict, there's no overcoming, there's no anything.
So MMOs that are vertical progression, like Final Fantasy and World of Warcraft, struggle with everything you're describing. Because they either have to artificially add weakness, where you slay a god, and then you sit around in your triumph moment, and then a new expansion releases, and they say, hey, there's a place where we need to go and fight a new god, and when you get there, the pigs can kill you.
You just have to not root it in being Dragon Ball Z and instead in the stakes of characters. Like, you need to, if Golbez in the most recent patch comes out and opens avoidal tears all throughout the world onto Eorzea, the threat needs to not be, the world's in danger in and of itself. It needs to be the fallout of loss. I mean, like, the thing that Endwalker does well, right, in my opinion, is not the world's under siege or the world's threatened. It's look at all the people who are suffering from it, from trying to find their ways, how they deal with the death of the ones that they love. Because if every life matters, a threat can be much smaller than Endwalker. But if it matters and the people matter, then that's still good. Scope doesn't just have to get larger to matter.
From a development standpoint, Stormblood was the best production they've ever had. I assume, based on some of the statements, that it made sense. There was a lot of crunch going on, so I assume that's why the expansions after that did not maintain that pace, is that it wasn't healthy. Yeah. But Stormblood gets crapped on regularly by people who like Heavensward and people who like Shadowbringers.
Yeah, so there's I have so many thoughts about this that I think constantly. So the thing is that having replayed it recently too, the problem is yes, it spreads itself too thin in a sense, but part of the thing is that it succeeds wildly a lot of the times with characterization with parts of Othard. And then you go into Siren Song C, it just completely resets the energy, and now you're spending all that energy on meeting people and trying to understand people and stuff in Othard. And the problem is that this is supposed to feel synergistically. It's supposed to feel like, look at these juxtapositions of these two war zones, how they're the same, how their struggle is but instead it just feels like all the energy gets put to one place.
How do you handle?
And so I think that's where
how do you handle a war being fought on multiple fronts as an idea? Like one of the problems there is ideally it's so I think Endwalker does it fairly well at the beginning, where it tries to split us between what's going on in Charlian and Thavnair. Don't like that it gave me an order, but outside of the fact that the orders were weird, which is something they can change. Like, they can totally change that. World of Warcraft in Battle for Azeroth let you choose what areas you did in what order on launch, and now that it is in Chromie time, it is a manual order. You have to do the zones in a specified order, because the choice mechanically was an advantage from a load balancing. How do we split the player base so that the zones stop crashing?
I had always thought it was a creative choice. I had never even considered that. You're almost completely...
It's entirely server load balance.
The real reason that they're just putting all their money into servers right now is not even just server load.
That's why I have to think of all this stuff as canon in game, because if you start to think about, like, well, why was it a dev choice versus why was it a writing choice, it gets really hard. So how do you then handle NPCs? When do you introduce new NPCs? When do you let them die? What happens to NPCs after you leave an area? Like, one of the problems that I have with 14 is that we've carried this same merry band of NPCs with us for so long now that it starts to make it feel like they are that Superman. Like, they're not capable of dying.
What I think, my impression going into 6.x is that they're kind of aware of that, and that they have a story they want to tell with Y'shtola because of how much her story, how much she's like really been on like the trying to connect to the Reflections plan since Shadowbringers. But characters like Thancred and Urianger, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw them like take a backseat or halfway through leave, or because like they want to make Kryl a new, one of the main people by their own admission, which means you have to lose someone. Zero is now in the band, which means you have to lose someone, assuming you want to have a band of 8. Like, if they want to do that, like if that's their or band of 7.
Sure. Which now you start to get back into, and this is why the dev stuff keeps coming up, because I don't want the dev side to come up. I want it to be canon.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
But the dev stuff keeps coming up because you name 7, but what 7 does is 7 plus a Warrior of Light is exactly an 8-man. And when they talk about adding trust support for trials, you have to assume next expansion that all core MSQ trials would likely be supported by trust. They've never said that, but it is a very logical direction for the game to go, so that people experiencing the MSQ for the first time at 2 in the morning on a DPS that are super nervous about their mechanical skill or whatever have that option. Until they have the ability to start just like bringing your favorite people with you, which ideally at the first time you do it, you would just way break it. In my opinion, don't just slightly break it. I would break it like all the way. Like let us go take Haurchefant through all the trust dungeons. Let us go take Papalimo through all the trust dungeons. Like, if we're gonna break it, just break it.
What's the name? Doesn't it, like, don't they have a different, God, their naming schema for some of this shit is bad, but like there is the system where you can go back, like if you do the story dungeon in Shadowbringers with, like, you're supposed to do it with the Exarch, Lena, and Y'shtola or something, but then if you come back after you've finished it, I care that when the first time you play that system, it's whatever the subset of who it's supposed to be is what you have available. And then after that, it's like, go ham. The thing is that I think the solution I really do is just rotate the cast, and I don't rotate the like, oh, each an expansion you need to do. It's just like do what they're doing now. They're establishing new characters. Kryl is being built up through Endwalker. Zero, Varshan. Like, we've got more, like, just new blood's coming in, which means old blood's gonna get phased out. What I don't want is death to be the only way to get rid of a character.
Like, I want it to be this Octopath Traveler thing where I can build out my personalities, and maybe I can put different gear on them and different cosmetics on them and different stat builds and things like that. Like, let me break it. It's why I don't engage with it, because it feels like Squadron 2.0, and that's just not good enough. Like, I'm glad people enjoy it. I think that's awesome.
Right.
I hope they never introduce anything in the game that literally nobody wants. It's just not something that I want. But the other thing is, Yoshi P and Ian have both talked about how these games are planned for, budgeted, and begin work on them 2 years in advance or more. We are right now seeing content that was built, or at least brainstormed, when people were working from home that had never been allowed to do that.
With Yoshi P and his legendary producing abilities too, I wouldn't be surprised if something that gets scoped like 2 years in advance is like basically not that far off from like the final scoping, like,
Yoshi P said things like spare no expense, and we all heard that, but spare no expense was said, we're not to that point yet.
Right, and I guess I wouldn't say to anyone, I would never say to anyone who is frustrated right now, like, don't be upset. I just say, take a breath, it's gonna be okay. I just, it's just like I get it. I'm not saying like, oh, you just go take a break, right? But like taking a break or doing whatever you gotta do to not just stew in frustration.
Sure.
Is like really vital. Like, I just like, as having been played MMOs for almost 20 years now is really vital.
The shadow of like what's going on in the devs world, like what was going on when this was brainstormed, which is, it sounds like in both games cases, somewhere in the ballpark of 2 years before they're published, all the way up to and even after that content is published, and then how does that content age, is always a shadow on what we're talking about. Like I'm here to chat with you about lore, but you can't separate the lore from the mechanics of the gameplay, just like you can't separate the lore of a book from the fact that it has to be something that can be written, or the lore of a movie because it has to be something that's filmable.
So I mean, maybe we've just expunged, we've allowed ourselves to expunge the best of it. That, you know, and so just restricting it down, that I guess that's probably why I'm trying in my brain to figure out, like, to not figure out, to be like topic, like specific, like something to cling to that prevents like meandering off, right? Like metaphysics or geography, or because then it's a very narrowed scope of like, there's a lot to talk about within that, but then it's like, what is, you know, it's not, oh, how does that, it's just, okay, why is the burn like the fucking, what is it called,
You think it's like Daenerys?
Yeah, like Daenerys, thank you. I mean, literally Ungoro crater is not that different from Ogomoro. Even nomenclature wise.
So the goal of today was to sit down and talk about Final Fantasy XIV versus World of Warcraft. But the goal is each Thursday between now and FanFest, we're going to sit down and talk through these. And we'll have an order predefined, and that will give you and me the ability to go research this. I would like to have a general idea of how I feel about the 14 side of it, but my goal is to bring some examples of the World of Warcraft method, and then ideally you, as the representative of Eorzean Archives, would bring a deep Final Fantasy XIV side, and we can compare and contrast and discuss at length
Definitely.
Each of these topics. That gives us kind of a once-a-week thing. So if the summary is the last week, week 11...
So it's like, if you're feeling up to researching it, I think geography is the best place to start.
And then next would be the physics. And so that's like the 5 aspects, the elements.
We also have nation states, politics, and races. Because I think you need to, if you're talking about afterlife, there's multiple perspectives. There's an absolute truth of what the afterlife is in 14, but there's also a bunch of different people with different stories and perspectives. Let me pitch this then. So you got geography and metaphysics as like a duology, up as like almost like a 2 thing. Then you go into the trilogy that is nation states and politics and deities and afterlife. Then you have like a little bit of a break going out of that with time travel, because you've kind of going out of these like nebulous kind of subjects. Then after that, you go into the Echo, Warrior of Light versus Champion of Azeroth, supporting casts and jobs and classes as like a final 3 trilogy. I think the problem is going to be fitting it all in rather than running out. Cataclysms, or the Umbra Calamities versus the like various cataclysms of WoW, because the way in which the Umbra Calamities can line up with things like the destruction of the Well of Eternity or like certain moments in history, I think is actually really applicable.
Okay.
I think there's like a really interesting, and the way in which the world adapts to that is really interesting, because 14's very cyclical, whereas WoW is.
So you want to talk about like events such as like wars, eras. So we'd be looking at like
major events. But I mean, you know, one of the other things that both of them have is that, I mean, to be fair, I was going to say WoW has a you know, progenitor race, progenitor beings thing, and it went with the Titans. But then I just realized the Titans are actually, there's a progenitor race of the Titans, which is the, you know, like, so they've got, you know.
This is why I never get into WoW lore, as opposed to like, I love getting into something from, you know, a singular universe. Like I love talking about, be it Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings or something, because at least then I'm like, well, I'm researching from a finite well, and that well's only goal, in theory, is to replenish itself with logical, canonical data. That's not been how it's been maintained, as we've like seen things like Star Wars change ownership. But in general, if you're studying everything that came from Tolkien, you're studying everything that came from the same source.
I mean, it turns out creative direction is really important, you know? And I think, and I think if you pay attention to UGP interview, is that he gets that, and he makes it so people like Ishikawa don't have to deal with a bunch of shit. They just like, they can just do that.
Right.
there is room to take something and run with it and do it well. It's just incredibly hard.
Because the writer's room is one thing, but then there's execution. So like the localization team has a huge impact on how we receive the story as people who consume the English version of the game. And every localization of the game has to, like, somebody's managing that.
So Kate Quinner is the lead,
Now.
has been the lead since Shadowbringers.
Uh-huh.
Right. And so my thing is that she was a part of his team.
She's homegrown talent, right? Like, she wasn't brought in from being a... My understanding is there was Koji Vox, and he had Kate on his team.
Yes.
And now Kate is in charge, but she was brought up through the minor leagues to the major leagues instead of drafting somebody from another team.
And I think that's just what you do. I think you just keep doing that. You just make it so that, like, you foster talents, not just at the high level, but at a lower level too. Someone who understands the culture, someone who, there's also the shorthand. There's institutional knowledge that's understood. There's shorthand that between people who work together that's understood. You know, whether that's the writing team, whether that's just if you're a head writer and you understand exactly what you can ask Yoshi P for and what you can't, like what you can take advantage of and what you can't, like that just saves so much time.
World of Warcraft feels like their team that develops professions is fractured every expansion. And the only team that's really comparable to that within 14 is we've had that described to us that that's what happens to the teams that work on Ultimates. That it burns teams out. And as a result, Ultimates are inconsistent on when they release, and they're inconsistent on what the word difficulty means. In theory, the new Ultimate was supposed to be easier than DSR. And so, like, they're wildly inconsistent compared to, like, what we expect from a Savage, what we expect from a writing team, what do we expect from a new expansion. Those things are very well detailed because you have a team that even if a new team's in charge, they're at least handed the reins from the previous people.
That's the thing, is that MMOs aren't sprints. They're just not. And, like, not just in terms of sprints, in terms of completing the thing. It's like you can lose everyone and then hire everyone and okay, you make the next expansion, but to make it feel like this world is living, you have to make it feel like there's internal consistency, and that doesn't just mean literal lore logic, right? That can also mean tone. That can also mean character actions. It can also mean any number of things.
WoW, I think, has done a worse job seeing the future than 14. I think that's Yoshi P's biggest strength, is I think people like to look at 14 and say, look at how great it is, and give Yoshi P the credit. But in reality, Yoshi P does very little of the actual gameplay. He doesn't write the music. He doesn't design the battle sequences. He doesn't design the classes. He doesn't write the lore. He doesn't, draw the world. He doesn't do any of that. What he does do is pick, manage, and enable the people that do. Like nothing in 14 was built by Yoshi P. Yet nothing could have been here without him.
And I think one of the things that, and I don't remember which interview, but he talks about this, is like one of the reasons that he also acts as the figurehead is not because of, like, someone needs to be a figurehead for projects so that everybody else does not have to be part of, like, the, like, PR team figurehead. Sure. Like it's like he let it all just be focused on him, the ire, the joy, the, like, the whatever. Keep the team safe to do their shit, you know?
Yeah.
The two things, too, is, like, he does a really good job of doing his best to make someone feel heard. That doesn't mean I'm saying everyone feels heard with, like, Yoshi P stuff, but that, listening is a skill. Teaching is a skill. Communicating is a skill. I have no idea what happened.
So I think on that note, I'm going to get going. And the goal is to edit these and post these. I'll try to post the big raw version over to Gaming Kinda 2, and then maybe try to cut it down onto the first Gaming Kinda. This is episode 0 of a 11 episode series that will lead us into FanFest, and we'll compare World of Warcraft versus Final Fantasy, and we will get just as distracted as we did today. Today the goal was to write an outline, and we talked about M ratings versus E ratings, and Game of Thrones and...
It was important conversation. It was the foreplay to the grander endeavor.
And the goal is 1 to 1.5 hours, which is why we're at 2 hours and 20 minutes. So, thank you. This was
absolutely great. Yeah.
I will see you next Thursday, and we'll be filming these every week around the same time.
Cool.
Be a good time. Take care.
Cheers.